Good. Well, welcome everybody to another in our webinar series at BIPS. I'm Charles Melville, the current president of BIPS, and we have another interesting and active talk today. Before we start, I should just mention that this is being recorded live on Facebook, and that an edited, a lightly edited version will appear on our BIPS YouTube channel for anyone who misses it now or would like to see it again. I might also remind you that the talk will last about 40 minutes, and there'll be an opportunity for asking questions, which if you'd please put in the Q&A, I will relay them to Arezou, or between us we'll look out for them. I think the chat is disabled, so there's no point putting anything in the chat. I should also just say to advertise our future programs that we have several events coming up, but you'll have to check the BIPS website for specific details. Mainly we have Said Ajumand is giving the Lambton Lecture. That's a collaboration between Durham University and BIPS with a provisional title of Political Thought in Medieval and Early Modern Iran, Islamic or Persianate. This will be in early June. And we have some other events lined up fairly soon, coming up in May. So for now, it's my pleasure to invite Arezou Azad to give our paper today. She was brought up in Germany, but nevertheless did her PhD in Oxford, and she's had a glorious career since then, turning to academic work after being a UN peacekeeper, which has probably equipped her very well for the hurly-burly of academic life. She's had a couple of books out already, one called Sacred Landscapes of Medieval Afghanistan. This was published in 2013, about the various Buddhist monasteries and temples in the Qubbat al-Islam, which was the name for Balkh. And very recently, an edited text, edited and translated and heavily commentated text on the Fadaili Balkh, which is a famous local history, again concerning Balkh in the early Islamic period. Her work is focused on the period from the rise of Islam to the coming of the Mongols, which you could call the traditional Abbasid era. And she's been extremely successful raising grants. She had an Invisible East program with the AHRC, our PERS Doc project, and an ERC grant as well, Go Local. And her earlier work was on Balkh Art and Culture History Project 2011 to 2015, which had a Leverhulme Trust. So as you can tell, she's worked a lot on the outer limits of the Persian world, especially Central Asia and Afghanistan. And she's now going to talk about her current project, entitled Unheard Voices from Eastern Iran and the Eastern Islamicate World. So welcome, Arezou, and we'll look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Can you all hear me, or can you hear me, Charles?
I can.
Thank you. I will now share my screen. Hope that this works. There. Okay. Well, thank you again for this very kind introduction, Charles, and thank you, Sylvia, for all the technical support in getting this webinar set up. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to speak to you. And I look forward to also having a discussion after my 40 minutes or so of introducing you to this new program, which we've called Invisible East, which is hosted at the University of Oxford and which I have the pleasure of leading. We're new. We've been building up our team in the middle of the pandemic, which has been fun. And as Charles mentioned, we have also been enjoying the generous support of the donors, that Charles mentioned, as well as the German Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. The impetus for this program came to me when I was a student of Islamic history, and as Charles mentioned, that is actually not that long ago, since I chose this line of study sort of quite late as a mature student after having served the United Nations for over a decade. And as someone who came from a peacekeeping and development background and who had dealt with a lot of people from all walks of life, from peasants to heads of state, and also as someone who had grown up and worked in a multilingual environment, I was struck by two things during my studies in Islamic history. And one was, I felt the silence in the books that I was reading on the regular people, business owners, traders, female villagers, and so on. And I felt I was essentially learning a history of caliphs, of kings, maybe the occasional queen, generals, and scholars, and court entourages, all of which is interesting, but it's not the whole story, is it? And so I thought this field seemed to lack in social history. The second thing that struck me was the silence I perceived on the Persian and Eastern Iranian or Eastern Islamicate world's contributions to early Islamic history, that is before the Mongols. Early Islam was still very much treated as an Arab or Arabian product imposed upon non-Arabs. I know I'm exaggerating here, and lots of scholars have shown us that it is not the case, but essentially it's still institutionalized like this within academia. So Islamic history programs are staffed by Arabists mainly, not Persianists, and equally Iranian studies programs, or Iranistic as it's known in Germany, do not consider things Arabic and sometimes even Islamic to fall within their remit, considering themselves to be guided by language rather than space. And I think that this slightly dichotomous approach doesn't really work when you're dealing with a multilingual and multicultural environment that the Islamicate East was during the first 500 years of Islamic rule. And as a result of this sort of institutional division, these crucial first 5 centuries of Islam in this region has fallen through the cracks. And that's what we're trying to fill, this gap. Let's think about the first problem. Where are the regular people? In the field of historical studies more generally, scholars have moved on from focusing exclusively on kings and churches and generals and so on, to including the history of the regular people. This trend was kickstarted by people like Carlo Ginzburg, who I've shown here, professor of history at Bologna, UCLA, and also Pisa, who is quoted as citing the German playwright, one of my favorite, Bertolt Brecht, whose literate worker asked, "Who built Thebes of the 7 gates?" The reference, of course, is to the anonymous masons who built these mythical gates that had defended Greek armies from against their invaders. Point is, we don't know their names, we don't know who they were, we only know the army leaders. So out of this arose a focus on what's sometimes called micro-histories, and Ginzburg was a master of them. We don't have this for the early Islamicate East. And I have to say, I don't mean to disparage in any way the important, really essential work that has already been carried out by previous scholars on this region and period, the likes of Edmund Bosworth, and prior to him, Vladimir Minorsky and Vladimir Bartold. They set really important frameworks on the political and geographic history of the region before the Mongols. Also, Iranian scholars such as Iraj Afshar and others have produced really important editions of historical texts, but rarely in these works do my colleagues go down to the micro level or consider its value in a comparative historical framework. One reason for this gap is indeed the disciplinary divide I mentioned, but we also have a source problem, it would seem. Early history books of the first 3 centuries of Islam are all written in Arabic and in faraway places, notably Baghdad, which was, of course, the caliphal capital. They are too removed geographically to be well-informed or even to care too much about faraway places like Balkh and Ghazni. Even the Persian histories that appear from the 11th century onwards, such as the Bayhaqi's history of Ghaznavid sultans or Seljuk histories, are again focused on kings and queens and their rulers and entourages. We also have local histories, of course, that grew in the 10th to 12th centuries in Arabic and Persian that give us more of a flavor of the local level, at the local level, but again, they never quite get as concrete as we would like because they're very much focused on the lives of scholars and saints rather than of regular people. So it would seem that these voices are silenced. We would never be able to do what Ginsberg had done for his 16th century hero, Menocchio from Montereale in Italy, whose worldview comes to life thanks to the legal court records that Ginsberg was able to consult. Why can't we do this for our region? Apparently it's because we lack documents. And unlike Ginsberg, but also unlike colleagues working closer to our region in the early Western Islamicate world. I'm going to show you a little bit of what has been happening here. I should clarify that by documents, we mean texts. These are everyday use texts, bills, contracts, deeds of purchase, leases, letters, things that you and I have in our homes today. And this kind of writing is distinguished from literary texts, such as narrative histories, poetry, and so on. So early Islamic documents are what has spurned an important subfield in Islamic history through the work on the Cairo Geniza, which started in the late 18th century. Let me just move this. In this image, you see Solomon Schechter trawling through tens of thousands of these fragments found in the Ben Ezra Mosque in Cairo and transferred to the University Library of Cambridge. His work continues today in the work of his many successors, including Marina Rustow, who heads the Princeton Geniza Lab. She does fascinating work on reused papers. Shown here, you can see large writing running horizontally from an original decree of a Fatimid caliphate written in 10th to 12th century Egypt. This document was then deaccessioned and bought up as recycled paper by Jews linked to the synagogue and reused for new purposes, religious and non-religious. Paper, as you can imagine, was a valued commodity, which explains its reuse. The point is that these documents are written by regular people or for regular people. Also from Egypt, another major source of documentary evidence constitutes the 8th century papyri I'm showing you here on the left. This is a restored specimen, by the way. Very few of them look this pristine. Documents such as these have enabled colleagues such as Petra Scheibenstein in Leiden and a larger group of papyrologists around the world over the past decades to reconstruct the lives of regular people or indeed provincial officials. What emerges is a dynamic and bottom-up approach to the view of this world. So what about the Islamicate East then? Well, it turns out we're not quite as devoid of documentary evidence after all. Actually, there are hundreds of them. And how can that be? What happened to them? My colleague Majid Muntazir Mahdi, who recently joined us in Oxford from Exeter, reminded me of the theory-ladenness of observations. That is the scientific appreciation that it is always the investigator's theory that determines his or her findings. It was supposed to be true that we had no or too few documentary sources, and so no one queried any other data with this question in mind. So where are these documents? They are spread out across libraries and private collections around the world, in London, St. Petersburg, Beijing, Jerusalem, Kabul, and many more places. The provenance and acquisition of these documents is not unproblematic, and I'm talking to you today about what is accessible to the public. Given their huge contribution to finally bringing the granular detail to the early Islamic history of the region, they cannot be ignored by historians, I would argue, or indeed people interested in the history of the region. Don't think that these documents have languished or been ignored. It is our philologist colleagues who have studied them and engaged in the complex deciphering of these previously unknown languages or excruciatingly difficult scripts. I'll show you two examples in a minute, but let me quickly clarify to you what we mean when we talk about Islamicate East or Eastern Iran. Take your pick of which terminology you prefer. I'll be the first to admit that none of them is perfect. What we mean by medieval is the first 500 years of Islamic rule here. That's the 8th to the 13th century. The brown line here in the map encapsulates the Islamic Caliphate that ruled over this area at this time, which in the west covers North Africa, Arabia and the Middle East, and the coast of East Africa. The caliphal capital is in Baghdad, where I've just popped up this blue place marker, while the Eastern Iranian or Eastern Islamicate region, which I'm indicating here by this very crude green circle, we call the Islamicate East as well, which includes northern parts of the Indian subcontinent, that's today's Pakistan and North India, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, up to Western China in today's Xinjiang province. The term Islamicate deserves a brief interjection from me as well. I use this term to denote the cultural and political system that grew out of Islamic rule. It does not mean at all that everyone in this region was Muslim. Far from it. In fact, Muslims didn't reach majority figures here until the end of this period, and in some places much, much later. Coming back to the documents that needed decoding, as I mentioned, here's one, and it's Bactrian. Nicholas Sims-Williams and his colleagues cracked the Bactrian code. The language survives in some inscriptions, but also in 200 documents, one of which I'm showing you here on the slide. Bactrian is an Iranian language that uses Greek cursive script, a hangover from the days of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC and his successors, the Seleucids, who ruled over this area. So these documents were found in the region of Rob, which is in northern Afghanistan, located some 100 miles or so southeast of Balkh. The Bactrian documents, which date from the 4th to the 8th century CE, are not royal or palatial. They come from a rural metropolis. 37 of them are from the first 2 generations since the arrival of Islamic rule here in the early to mid 8th centuries. The 8th century documents, some are written in Bactrian, some in Arabic, belong to an archive of a local land-owning family. They give us insight into the way local aristocrats and agricultural production were connected, what fruits people ate, whom they married, how they settled family disputes, what tax rates they had to cover, and so on. This is wonderful micro stuff, although it might not be quite as micro as we would like, since these are still owned by local aristocrats, but local they are, and therefore very interesting to us. These are regular people doing day-to-day things. The corpus also is large enough in its time span, 400 years, to allow us to trace trends and changes over time, such as shifts in marriage practices. And we can deduce the reasons for these shifts that are not always the most obvious, where, for example, economics rather than ideology seem to determine choices on whom people marry. Languages needed to be decoded, but scripts also needed to be deciphered. This is my second example. I'm showing you one of the several hundred Middle Persian documents found in Qom and Tabaristan in today's Iran in the early Islamic period and written in the Pahlavi script that is notoriously difficult to read, so I'm told by my colleagues on the team who are the experts. They were written, as I said, they were written in the 8th century, right up to the 10th century, and therefore serve as documentary evidence for early Islam in Iran proper. And yet, no Islamic historian, or almost none, have used these as sources. It has taken scholars like Dieter Weber in Germany almost their entire scholarly career to make tentative readings and translations of these, which are often written on scraps of linen or leather. The decipherment task is not finished as Professor Weber continues to revise his readings, which he does quite often. For all of this work, we're hugely indebted to our philologist colleagues, whose work is no less reminiscent than Alan Turing's famous cracking of the Nazi Enigma code. A quick word on what I mean when I say Iranian languages. Both Bactrian and Middle Persian belong to the Indo-Iranian language family. So for those who might not be familiar with what I mean by that, so here's a table from a recent book that studies the development of languages, in which Persian or New Persian is a case. And he shows, McWhorter, who wrote this, lists 21 languages that are part of the Indo-Iranian language family. Our study only includes 5 out of this list. In addition to these 5, we're also covering Judeo-Persian and Arabic, which is, of course, it's a mythic language. All of these 7 languages were active at the time of the Muslim conquests in the Islamicate East and up to the 10th century, and only New Persian then is attested beyond that up to the present day, which is the Persian that is spoken today in the region. So one question for us is, why did New Persian grow out of the Islamic conquests, and why did people not adopt Arabic here like other places such as Egypt and Syria? Moreover, the older languages continued to be used, such as Middle Persian, in which we frequently find terms that are calques from Arabic. While Middle Persian was developing side by side with New Persian and Arabic in one and the same region, in this case, Qom and Tabaristan, or Bactrian, New Persian and Arabic further east in the Balkh, Bamiyan, and Ghur region of Afghanistan. McWhorter suggests that it is the simplicity of the New Persian language that gives away its evolution. People who didn't grow up with Arabic and only spoke it broken, dropping case markers and so on, many of us who are children of immigrants recognize this from the way our parents speak the language of the adopted land. They developed this new hybrid language in which Indo-Iranian languages and Arabic intermixed. And so the New Persian language, the Persian language development is in itself a marker of Islamization. Let me now get to our program. Altogether, we are working with about 1,000 texts from the region, most of which have so far been left out of the historical narrative. Some of the sites from which they came lay beyond the big centers of power, but I hasten to add that these are no rural backwaters. So we've already seen these. One site is Rob, another site is Tabaristan and Qom, which we've also seen. Mount Moor in Uzbekistan is where Sogdian documents come from, another Iranian language. And Khotan in today's Xinjiang region is the region from which hundreds of Khotanese documents come, also in Iranian language. And finally, Bamiyan and the adjacent Ghur region have left us with several sets of Persian documents, which I'll be talking about more in a minute, as well as a few Arabic documents. Let me introduce you to our team, which, as you've seen, requires a highly specialist and niche expertise to cover the blend of 7 languages and 7 scripts. So as I said, I'm the PI and I'm the Persianist on the team, one of the Persianists. Our postdocs, starting from the top left and going around in the clockwise direction, are Janjang, who is an expert of old Iranian languages and is working with Khotanese, Sogdian, and Bactrian in our team. Then comes Pejman Firuzbakhsh, based in Hamburg, who works with the Persian documents. Majid Muntazer Mahdi, who is an expert of Islamic law and fiqh and works with Arabic and Persian documents. Tommy Benfi, an expert on late Sasanian and early Islamic Iran, works on Middle Persian and Arabic. And of course, last but not least, Hugh Kennedy, whose long and deep research on the caliphal centers in Iraq, but also on administrative systems and agricultural systems, is providing important intellectual input as we compare that central view with what is happening here further east. What we want to know is we want to know the legal, economic, and political foundations upon which the eventual Islamization of the communities rested. We want to know the language influences on the nature, extent, and results of Islamization and the variations in the foundations and interactions over time in this highly diverse region. The investigation has a long view and follows from scholarship of the recent decades, which has overturned previously held notions that Islamization was all about conversion to Islam and that conversion happened always by force or by the sword. This kind of instant change is not borne out in the evidence, and in fact, it's not how things happen in general. The world is a world of gradual changes which are influenced by a multitude of factors, not just violence or fear. Other factors include money, business interests, cultural affinities, greed, legal and political contexts in which these transformations occur. The term Islamization needs to be understood like this. It refers to the gradual growth and spread of Islam as a political, economic, and legal system over the centuries. What then was the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims in this period, long before modernity, and what can we learn from it when compared to our own time? We are only coming to grips with these questions now, whilst we read and decipher or redecipher the documents. Seeing as the Persian documents and local texts from Afghanistan form the newest and still largely unpublished set of documents, I will now introduce you to some of these. Let me start by clarifying that New Persian is usually referred to Persian written in Arabic script, while Judeo-Persian is referred to Persian written in Hebrew script, which was used by Jews. By the way, images I'll be showing you are all publicly accessible on the National Library of Israel website, which owns about 200 of these. And all of these date to between the 11th and 13th centuries, making this by far the largest set of the earliest New Persian texts known in the world. It only became publicly accessible in 2017. Some refer to it as Afghan Geniza, but I avoid the term because Geniza, being a Hebrew term, might give the wrong impression that all these documents are Jewish or came from a synagogue, which is not the case here at all. In addition, another set of circa 100 Persian documents from Afghanistan, also from this period, has come to light. They were actually published in Kabul more than 10 years ago, and I'm showing you the book cover here, but only received international notoriety very recently when the private owner donated them to the National Archives of Afghanistan last year. We don't have high-resolution images of these, which is why I won't be showing you these, but we believe they come from near Firuzkoh in the Ghur region of Afghanistan, which is why they're sometimes referred to as Ghurid documents. And prior to these, only a handful of Persian documents were known from this very early period, and one of these was, again, from Bamiyan. So this quantitative leap is truly impressive, but also the diversity in these documents, which we have been identifying over the past months. Let me introduce you to some. So one group is poetic. These sheets we have now understood to have belonged to an oblong notebook. Here we find the beginning of a panegyric poem written for a Simon-Tov ben Abu Nasr ben Daniel. He was a Jewish patron who is known to us from other documents in the set, which are being studied by Ophir Chaim at Princeton as we speak. And he was a landlord together with his father in Bamiyan in the 11th century. So this is in fact the oldest surviving sheet of Persian poetry ever. This is not a Rumi or a Hafiz or a Ferdowsi or anything like that. But what makes this so fascinating is that it's so old, because the sheets of Rumi's poetry and others come from a much later period. While here we have something much closer to the poet's time. The author is not a court poet, nor is he a refined lyricist. He is trying his hand at some well-trodden metaphors, clouds and tears, but it is written for a local patron, not a sultan, and it's written by a Muslim or a Jew. Why do I think he's Muslim? Because he's using Arabic script Persian. And it turns out, we have been looking at other sheets in the set, that there are more, that this poem continues on other sheets, and the plot thickens because the poet explains to us why he is asking this gentleman, Simon-Tov, for money. He's been running a party, hosting a party at his place with copious amounts of wine and silver and fruit and so on, and he can't afford it. So he wants Simon-Tov to help him out, and he's starting to panic, which we can tell from his last line, which is, the urgency is now. If we, so if we go back to the first sheet, there's one more thing I want to show you. If we turn that first sheet of the poem around, this is what we find. And what is this? It has nothing to do with the poem, at least not the top and bottom bits, which I've circled for you in blue, which are written in Judeo-Persian or Hebrew script Persian. And thanks, with the help of colleagues, Judith Olshovic-Schlanger and others, we have been able to read this partially and to identify these as commercial notes. It seems to be Simon-Tov or his assistant who is keeping track of loans that have been issued to people, either in Shiani, which is the local silver currency, or in textiles. And what's really interesting here also is that Simon-Tov is very comfortable in switching between scripts, between Hebrew and Arabic script, but writing in Persian. And the part in the middle, by the way, that's an Arabic script, is just more verse, which is related to the other page and shouldn't concern us here right now. Another set are legal documents. Here, this one can be identified as an iqrar, which was a widely used type of acknowledgement deed involving two or more parties, as in this case concerning a debt, which needs to be paid back in installments at set deadlines. A penalty clause is also included for the possible non-payment of the debt. And we recognize this document type from the Egyptian corpuses as well. But these are the very first Persian specimen. Let's take a closer look. The Persian text is formulaic, and we recognize some of the formulae from the Cairo Geniza as well, such as the statement that the muqir, the one who is making the acknowledgement, usually the debtor, is of sound body and mind, and that he is agreeing to this voluntarily and is not coerced in any way. Another formulaic expression is this one, and also witness statements, which I can talk about in the Q&A if anyone's interested. Another set of documents are private letters. I like this letter very much, even though the top of it is missing, because I think it's very sweet how the person who's writing it seems to really care about the addressee who seems to be in financial trouble and has left the hometown. And he says, you know, please tell me, you know, what you owe these people, and let me take care of it. And please keep writing to me. So I think that's very sweet. This letter is not dated, but it's very, very early. And I can explain to you later why, but maybe you can already recognize these dots under certain consonants, which is a very early convention. By the way, on this is one of the very few letters from this very early period that is written in Arabic script. And we think this might be actually a recent convert to Islam, only because of all these pious phrases that are added in the end, which is also very unusual for these documents. We also get administrative orders like this misal, which this one's also interesting. I think I'll tell you a little bit, but it's basically a senior official who is writing to his subordinate who has gone AWOL, who's gone off the rails and has received safe passage somewhere else. Clearly the boss is angry and he's ordering him to come back, but he's still being very diplomatic because he clearly doesn't know his exact address. He says, wherever you may be, which means he must have sent it to someone who has to read it and find him. So he probably doesn't want to seem overly pedantic. What's also interesting here is that normally these documents, these misals, are written in a rotula style. They're much longer. And this is in fact the lower third of what was a much longer document. And the reason why this has been preserved in this way becomes clear when you again turn the page, because when you turn the page, you will see that this was again reused as a document. So this rotulus must have been cut up in pieces after it lapsed and was deaccessioned and then sold and then was reused. Another type is this, which is an istiftah document. So this is a request to a legal scholar to provide advice on a particular question that is concerning what we think is probably a more junior legal scholar in this town that it came from, or village, probably more village, and is all related to the triple divorce. As some of you probably know, in Islamic practice, divorces can only happen with repetition 3 times of a divorce, but these repetitions, this triple pronouncement cannot happen in immediate succession. So there is some confusion amongst the questioner on this, and he's asking for clarification. There is a third question, by the way, on the back of this sheet. But again, we have these kinds of documents also in Arabic, from Syria and Egypt, but these are the first in Persian. By the way, this might be indeed a Persianization of an Arabic practice, but we're also not discounting the possibility that this is actually something linked to earlier practices in the region. We have a very similar rivayat practice amongst Zoroastrians and also responsa in Jewish practice. A little word on, I've already spoken about materiality. So I just want to say that we don't only look at the content, we also look at the paper as an artifact that tells us lots of things. So for example, here we have fold lines, and given that decrees, for example, were never folded but rolled, and iqrars were folded, it is the fold lines that can actually help you in understanding the type and the sequencing in the life of a recycled document. And the folding happens because this is how people archive documents. Here's a picture from Yemen that Brinkley Messick took not too long ago, but it probably resembles more or less how these documents were archived a long time ago already. Other things we get from the artifactual aspects are the handwriting. So we're starting to identify handwriting, and by then looking at those of the same hand together, you can start to build up a profile of the scribe, and you can get a sense of his or her education, socioeconomic background, and loyalties. I'm coming to the end of my talk, just to let you know how we work. So we read these documents individually and within the team, but we then also meet with experts outside. And up on the top of the screen, I wanted to show you a set. This is one of several meetings we had with our colleagues at the Dekhoda Institute and the University in Tehran, as well as the Miras Maktub in Tehran, whose expertise are truly mind-blowing, and without whom we wouldn't have been able to fill some of our gaps in our readings. We're working offline right now, but all this information, the images, the transcriptions, the translations will eventually be put into a digital corpus that is going to be set up for us, which will be searchable, sort of like a Google search of these documents. And we're also in discussions with colleagues who are running other databases to make our database intersearchable with theirs. But this will be the first for the Iranian languages. And I think I'm at my penultimate slide, just to say that these kinds of data will finally be able, will allow us to answer really interesting questions on materiality and literacy, languages of prestige, religion and language, economics, law, and writing. And we will also be producing a number of books and peer-reviewed articles, of course. But what's really important for us is also to engage with the public on these by going obviously on social media. So whoever is not yet following us might like to. Our Twitter handle is Invisible Ease, or you can write to us if you'd like to be added to our mailing list. So in closing, I think the unheard voices are coming alive through this incredible wealth in documents that have been either overlooked by historians or only recently became available for research. We're only at the beginning of this research, but the incredible wealth and detail in these documents, has the potential to advance our knowledge through microhistory, a past that is relatable and can hopefully serve as a mirror for the present. Thank you. I will stop sharing.
Excellent, Arezou, thank you very much. Well, it's a remarkable demonstration of what's out there still, and good luck. It does sound as though you've got a lot of very competent people working in your team to help decipher all this. I only had one immediate thought as we were going through. I mean, I agree with all your introductory remarks about you know, the whole first 500 years of Islamic Persian history are treated as though they're Islamic Arabic history, which is something, even though most of it's anything interesting is actually happening in the Iranian world. So this is very good to help rectify that perception as well. You mentioned that we have nothing really about the common man, and probably from that period it's more or less true, but the hagiographies are the best source, I think, of life below elite level, where you have, okay, you're talking with saints who in a way are elite, but some of the more amusing collections of hagiography, even quite early ones like Jean Depil, you know, who was from Jam, they do even have names, and you know, they have different people coming along with their different problems and their wives and their drinking and all the rest of it. So I guess you can match some of this up with some of the more better known literary sources, although they're not many, of course. But
yes, no, absolutely. I mean, the Fazl al-Bauch, we just published on with Ed Herzig and Ali Mir Ansari is very much a hagiography as well. But it's first of all, they're focused on urban centers, so very cities, which these documents are not from cities. They're from places you don't get much information on. And also, I think the hagiographies obviously are often written with a sort of agenda, you know, where they might serve as models, certain Sufis or saints or whatever serve as models, and we have to take them with a bit of a pinch of salt if we're looking for slightly more factual information rather than metaphorical. So I think, you know, I'm not saying that archives don't come with agendas as well. You know, we have survival bias, which is something else we have to deal with. But I think the data is quite different between the two sets.
Sure. Well, I mean, the hagiography, apart from else, is more or less a polished and completed text, whereas these are clearly mainly fragments. Yeah. Just remind me, does the Cairo Geniza have Persian language documents? I thought it had some. It's not all Arabic, is it?
Yeah, no, it's not all Arabic at all, but it has very few. It has a few Persian documents in it that Shaul Shaked has published on most, but they're a handful. Yeah, and there are other languages too, but most of them are, I believe, in Arabic or Hebrew. Yeah.
And are you able? I know Nicholas Sims Williams has done quite a bit of work on the Bactrian stuff. I mean, are you finding sort of information and thoughts and ideas that he hasn't perhaps dwelt on in his own work? I mean, by bringing it into a wider context.
Yeah, I mean, Nicholas Sims Williams did a mammoth task just deciphering language, and I mean, his transcriptions and translations are of such an incredibly high quality. You know, he's delivered us the goods, and he even says it himself. Because, you know, I've delivered you the goods, the raw materials. Now you, historians and linguists and whatnot, now it's your job to actually make sense of all this. You know, so thank you to him. But it's not really his task. He doesn't consider himself a historian. So so that's what we're doing. And yeah, we're finding all kinds of amazing things that obviously Professor Sims Williams was not focused on. So for example, I mentioned the marriage practices, and Patricia Krohn, who passed away too soon, was just starting to get to grips with the Bactrian documents as well in her last book, Nativist Prophets, where she has a small annex on a few of the documents where you get a sense of fraternal polyandry being practiced here, just at the beginning of the Islamic presence. Fraternal polyandry meaning 2 or more brothers marrying one wife, which is a common practice in the region, and Tibet still today, actually. And then later documents where that seems to shift to a sort of single man and woman marriage situation. And the reason for this being economic rather than necessarily ideological. So that's one example, but there's more. We're finding out about formulaic expressions, for example, in the Bactrian documents that Zhang, my colleague, is recognizing in the Khotanese documents in faraway Xinjiang and in Sogdian documents. So now is the question, you know, who is influencing who? Where are these formats and traditions and legal frameworks coming from, and why do they look so similar or not? So yeah, these are all things that Nicholas Sims Williams doesn't go into because that's not really his task.
Sure. Well, I'm just letting the questions accumulate a bit here, but one other thing occurred to me. I mean, obviously these documents are now collected in various places, like Israel and you know, the couple of ones you mentioned, but how local are the actual documents? I mean, they've been collected essentially, or are they, I mean, how much do you know about how they were assembled and where they actually come from? Because some of these scribbles, you know, it's like the Geniza collection. You don't actually know where it was written. So how much of an angle is it the script that gives you a clue in that, or the handwriting generally, or?
So yeah, good question. So some of them give us toponym, place names. They mention place names, but not necessarily helpful, because these are so local that, you know, they mention places like, I don't know, Boloku, or I don't know,
Yeah.
Arezou Azad, or something like that. So and they haven't survived these place names. You know, we're still trying to figure out what to do with them. Maybe some have survived, and for that you need to be really in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So we're thinking about ways to tap into local Afghan knowledge on that. But sometimes you do get place names like Bamiyan, Ghazni, Balkh, and so on. So that already gives you an idea of more or less where they came. But how they were assembled.
But then, of course, inevitably, they're going to be sort of population centres. So you're back with the idea of it being a sort of urban preoccupations, probably, rather than rural ones.
Yeah, although, yes, you're right. But, you know, Bamiyan, for example, appears in a letter as a place, not where the person is writing from, but a place he refers to. So it doesn't mean it comes from Bamiyan, and it's mostly really very local place names. But also how they were assembled, some of it, we're still working on it, like I said, through handwriting, through archival practices and so on, and that's going to help us a lot. But provenance is, as I mentioned, is a big problem with
Yeah, because obviously in the end it'd be interesting to know how widely things varied over the same period across the whole region you're interested in. Anyway, I mustn't hog the questions. I should just say, anyone who's watching on Facebook rather than online, you can send a question via Facebook, and I've got one here, so I'll start with that and then switch to the Q&A. Herschel Hetner, Associate Curator of Hebrew Manuscripts, asks you, are there any manuscripts on parchment, or are they all on paper? And if all on paper, are there any with early ruling techniques by Hardpoint?
So no, they're not all on paper. The ones I showed in the National Library of Israel are on paper, but the Bactrian ones, for example, are not. They're on parchment. They're much earlier. They're from the 8th century. Same with the Middle Persian documents, and the Sogdian ones are on parchment. We also have Middle Persian ostraka, and I mentioned inscriptions for the Bactrian, for example, on rock, and so on. So we have all kinds of writing mediums for these. The second question, I'm not sure I can answer. Charles, could you repeat that second part of the question about rules?
Yeah, hang on. Well, if they're on paper, are there any with early ruling techniques? I mean, otherwise some sort of lines used by Hardpoint. I mean, created by Hardpoint.
I'm not sure.
Or are they just sheets?
Right. So I'm not sure.
Well, like.
But on sheets, what we do have is clear margins, you know, and we have spacing lines. So this comes with the expertise, really scribal expertise of how to draft these things. You do get that.
Okay. Well, David Galinsky, a former student of mine, hello David, says educated Jews would have known Arabic script also, as seen as, for instance, Ibn Kumuna. They were in business, and some of the contents and letters talk about land purchases from Muslims also. Is that right?
Land purchases from Muslims.
This would be Jews buying land from Muslims. Is there any sign of that so far?
I'm not sure. The ones I've read have not been about that, but I haven't read the Judeo-Persian ones. That's my so it may very well be. But of course, yes, Jews would have known Arabic script. I think I actually was showing, if you might remember, there was the backside of that poem, the first sheet, showing how Simon-Tov, or his assistant, was happily actually switching between Hebrew and Arabic script, all writing in Persian. So yes, absolutely, it seems that they were perfectly happy to use both. However, what we can tell is that Jews seem to prefer to use Hebrew script because whenever we see a document which was written by a Jew to a Muslim, it's written in Arabic script, but then the archival notes on top of that sheet or on the back of that sheet are written in Hebrew script. So.
Well, we've got a couple of admirers. Malcolm Rigsby, thank you very much. Is there a membership? I suppose that means a membership of your project rather than BIPS, but you can become a member of BIPS if you aren't already. And Roxana Zenhari, wonderful project. Thank you for sharing. And then Andrew Peacock from St Andrews says there are quite big differences in the paleography of the documents you showed. How confident are you they're all of similar dates? Or are there other reasons for the difference in paleography, e.g. the type of document?
Yeah, oh, that's also a good question. So that it's actually spanning these, I guess Andrew is referring to the ones, the Persian ones I was showing in the second half of the talk. And they actually span quite a long period. So the earliest is literally from the year 1000, and then the latest goes up to actually into the Mongol period, early Mongol period, so 1260s or so. So actually 260 or so years. So that might explain, certainly explains the difference in paleography. And I was pointing to, in the early Persian document from the year 1000, 1001, I was pointing to these orthographical features and so on, which are very different to the later ones. So, but we can see time, it's within this 260-year period or so, affecting the paleography. So they're not similar dates as such. And are there other differences, reasons for differences? Yes. So it's also, it has to do with the type of document that's written. So if it is a document that deals with accountancy and finances, you have the Siyar, for example, which is a sort of shorthand accountancy writing, which is sort of like, it reminds me of, you know, stenography, which I actually studied once a long time ago. It shows how old I am. But yeah, so it's also the type of document that might determine the script. You have different hands or different conventions of how you write certain documents. Poetry, for example, will be written very differently from a legal document or a finance document.
Yeah, Pegar Shahbaz, thank you for an excellent talk, thought-provoking. I have a question about the documents you've traced back from the 10th to 12th centuries. Would like to know if you have come across any manuscripts in the Buddhist or Manichaean or Zoroastrian temples?
Short answer is no. Not in the region that we're studying. That doesn't mean that there aren't any, but also we're not looking, I mean, we're not experts of these. The Bactrian set obviously is not 10th to 12th century, but is 8th century and earlier, 4th to 8th century. In that set, there are some sutras, some Buddhist sutra texts, which also haven't been studied much. So if this is an area that you have particular expertise in, I would point you to that.
Gita Chowdhury, can we locate the Anwari Suhaili as a literature produced in Eastern Iran, or rather a literature of Greater Iran? Not quite sure what the difference is there, but this was produced well, do you have an answer for that, Arezou?
I'm afraid I don't. I don't know the Anwar Suhaili, so I can't
It's
really.
a sort of calque on Kalila wa Dimna.
Okay. I mean, the story goes that the Kalila wa Dimna, which for those who don't know is the Arabic translation translation of the Sanskrit Panchatantra stories. And the story is that the person who they were dedicated to is a Barmakid. So the Barmakids were from Bal, so from this region, the Barmakids. The ancestors of the Barmakids, before the arrival of Islam, were keepers of the Buddhist temple and monastery, the Nobahar of Balkh, and therefore had connections to India, which is the reason perhaps why the Barmakids are connected to this work, but more than I'd say.
Yeah. And then Saqib Barbary, do you find commonalities between the genres, forms, and even phraseology of the pre-Mongol, Abbasid, and later Ilkhanid documents? Or do you find there's a clear break after the Mongol invasion? Thank you for a great presentation. I guess you haven't got much post-Mongol invasion. As you say, you got one or two from 1260, but...
Yeah, at this point, I wouldn't be able to say. Thanks for the question. But I wouldn't, from our region, I wouldn't be able to say. And I think we've got our hands full with what we've got we're working on right now. But yeah, would be. What I can say is we had recently, in March, we had a really interesting workshop with colleagues at the University of Exeter, who are working on this ERC project called Law Forms, and they're looking at Mughal. And I'm guessing you're interested in Mughal because you asked me a question day before yesterday on the Mughal. The Mughal legal documents, and we compared Iqrar, for example, with the Iqrar that we have that I showed you earlier, and we found an astounding parallel again between the two, but also some innovations. So there are some commonalities, but this is actually a really interesting question that we're looking at. So if you're interested, follow our Twitter, go into our Twitter account, because we tweeted a thread on that.
It does occur to me, of course, that the Mongol invasions are normally blamed for the lack of archival material and documents, you know, the destruction of libraries and so on. Of course, a lot of these documents aren't the sort of thing that would necessarily have been in libraries, except that, you know, they're a written record of something, and maybe there was a lot of destruction. What sort of condition are they in, the ones you've seen? Do they look as though they've had a badly beaten up, or have they survived in reasonably good condition?
I mean, the National Library of Israel documents have survived in an incredibly good condition. It's unbelievable. There's no way. I mean, we of course we were wondering, you know, might these be forgeries or something? But my colleagues who are experts, especially, you know, Pejman Fidusbakhsh and so on, who experts in these kinds of early Persian texts, think there's no way anyone could have forged these texts, just because they are so, I mean, the orthography, the paleography, everything, the folding and all that is just, yeah, you wouldn't be able to know that unless you're one of two.
And you'd wonder why anyone would bother anyway. It's not as though they're important on the art market. Well, a couple more questions, and then we're probably nudging towards our time. So you have a nice question here from Kirsty Schroff. Thank you so much for the informed view of the period. Are there any documents or thoughts to share on groups such as the Khuramis from Khorasan, related to Mazdakism, considered to be a Zoroastrian heresy in the Sasanian period? The Khuramis are reported to have been common people, yes, peasants, laborers and villagers, and represented a kind of Zoroastrian low church. But of course, if you can detect individual sort of religious sentiments in these, that would be interesting, especially dealing with the question of conversion.
Yeah, so Yeah, I mean, Khurramis are not specifically mentioned, but I would point you again to the Bactrian Documents, which Nicholas Sims Williams has translated, and the publication, you can buy it. It's not that expensive, actually. Surprisingly, it's 3 volumes, hardcover. And they tell you a lot about sort of local cults, which are probably lesser known, sort of gods such as Ramset and Varsh, which is of course the old name for oxus, who are venerated and who are actually invoked in these documents. So you do get a sense of some of these sorts of cults and religions from the Bactrian documents. So I would point you to those.
There's a similar sort of question from David Galinsky again. The region was known to be a region of religious sects and reactionaries such as the Hivi Ha-Balki, a Jewish heretic, also a Karaite stronghold. What will your project be aiming to do in relation to analysing religious turmoil and eclecticism among the non-Muslim and Muslim communities?
Yeah.
I suppose that depends on what you find. I mean, obviously, if you find some stuff, you'll go for it.
Yeah. We're waiting. We're looking. We're looking. But of course, if we strike gold like that, it will be great. I should have also mentioned for Kirsty's question. I didn't quite finish my answer actually because I hadn't finished my thought. But you do have different members of society that appear in the Bactrian documents. You have, for example, slaves. You have some fascinating documents in there that are slave manumission documents of different kinds. There's the kind where the slave is actually paying off his manumission himself. So so you get these documents saying, "Well done, you've now paid the next installment." You're really silly kind of thing. And you have, so that's one type of society, lower level, if you want, of society that you can get. You also you ask about villagers. Yeah, you get locations in the Bactrian documents of where these documents are being currently sort of legally enacted. So they're usually in a sort of market square in some town. So you get a sense of villages, small towns in that way. So yeah, again, sorry, just to point you to that. But then also, David, yes, we will be looking out for these, and we'll be sure to report on them if we find them.
Well, Peyman Heydarian just asked if you found any musical scores maybe annotated in Abjad.
Yeah,
probably not yet.
I'm just trying to think. Music. It's not ringing a bell right now, Peyman. But if we do, we'll definitely tweet it.
Well, I know there's one more coming back in the chat, but we're getting quite well after 6, so we'll just take these last couple and then maybe give you a rest, Arezou. Can you see Frank Lewis's comment here? An exciting project, and if made digitally accessible, extremely useful, not only for research, but also for teaching. Regarding the desire to intralink the project with other databases, digitizing published literary sources would also be helpful for economic and social historians. And he mentions the Jindipil, and then the wealth of social details it provides are generally incidental to the text's main objective. So there's not much worry about their being distorted. Yes, I agree. It's one of it's one of my favorite hagiographies, actually, because it's not really full of doctrine. It's all these marvelous sort of miracles, which, anyway, and Nasri Khosrow's travelogue also, it's also from that period, of course. Yeah, so there's a lot of useful comments.
I totally agree. If I may just quickly, I know we're running over almost, but I didn't get into that, but part of our research is also to cross-reference with the literary source material. So we're not rejecting it at all. We're just bringing it all together. So yes, absolutely agree with you. And the other thing on digital humanities, we're as I mentioned, we're planning to interlink with other databases, but we're also planning to link with, I don't know how much you know about the Kitab project and the Maryland Persian Manuscripts Initiative, but these are all digitizing currently published Arabic and Persian poetical works. And so we are also talking to them about, once our digitization is finished, to put that together and make that infrastructure as well.
Good. Well, we've just got a couple in the chat. Herschel Hepler, who asked the first question, thank you very much for this important presentation. I sadly missed the beginning. Read the Bactrian Documents. There were some investigations in 1997 as to their possible discovery in Dar es Souf in Samangan. Are you aware of any further evidence of this possible find spot?
Yeah, I actually, I've been there myself, passing through between Kabul and Mazar-e-Sharif, and I had heard that when I was there, but I haven't heard anything more since then. I think, I don't know, I think maybe ask Mr. Khalili who bought them. I can't tell you more than that.
We've got one more very quick thing, a comment about the Kalila Wedimna, which is popular with the Sasanian monarchs, which is true. I mean, it's a very old, of course, the actual stories go back a long way, and there's that famous bit in the preface to the Shahnameh about how it was brought from India and all the rest of it. So it certainly predates the immediate period that you're talking about. Anyway, I think we've exhausted everybody. Arezou, except of course the appetite for more, but that'll just have to wait. So I'll just thank you very much on behalf of everybody. Oh, hang on, one new message. I'll just see if it's in anything. It probably says, oh, all right, I'll just quickly ask this from VV. Can you use chemical composition of the ink used to date the Persian manuscripts, or use carbon dating on the paper? Presumably, yeah. In principle, you can, but...
Well, you can, and I know that this is also an idea that we might explore, and there are colleagues who could help us with that, either at the National Library of Israel directly, or at the Center for Manuscript Cultures in Hamburg, which is also so yeah, thanks.
They tend to be quite expensive once you get into scientific analysis. You know, you can have one test for 100 quid sort of thing. Anyway, yeah, so I won't again interrupt my flow. Arezou, thank you very much for your talk, and good luck with the project, which has clearly aroused a lot of interest, quite rightly, and we all look forward to hearing more about your results. So thanks again very much, and have a good evening, and thank you everybody for joining and for your questions.
Thank you. Thank you.